Welcome back to Evan Jake Sports, where fantasy football meets sport analysis. I've had a lot of people ask how I come up with my rankings for shorts and long form videos, so today I'm going to walk you through my full process, from raw projections to final rankings. In my channel, especially before the season starts, I like to look at stat projections. Stat projections, we can then calculate into total fantasy points into points per game, and then sort those fantasy points per game to give us rankings and value for players. To get my projections, I use CBS Sports and ESPN to get this year's stat projections and prior year performance for comparison. And then I use Prize Picks for season-long betting lines. Once I have my projections, I'm going to need to compare them to something to see if they're reasonable. Sportsbooks often do a good job of season-long predictions, so I use that as one of my comparison metrics. And all of this gives me a balanced view from analysts, the fantasy community, and sportsbooks. But before we get our final projections, I need to verify the data. I often find discrepancies between team QB stats and receiving stats, like passing yards not matching their receiving yards, or mismatched targets and pass attempts. If we take a look at the Vikings, for example, we'll see that CBS projects them to have 5,016 receiving yards as a team, as well as 565 targets. For their QBs, JJ McCarthy and Sam Howell are only projected for a total of 4,100 passing yards and 520 pass attempts. So these don't add up. I then need to normalize by averaging the totals. In this case, we get 4,569 receiving yards for the team and 543 pass attempts or targets for the team. I can then use this team metric against their shares to give each player their appropriate numbers. So now that I have their normalized team totals, I use each player's originally projected share to allocate stats. For instance, CBS projected Justin Jefferson to have an original of 1,601 receiving yards out of the team's total 5,016 receiving yards, which would then say he is getting 32% of the team's receiving yards. If we take his now new team total of 4,500 receiving yards by the amount of receiving yards he's supposed to have, he's going to have 1,458 receiving yards. You can apply the same process to targets. If he had a 27% target share originally, we're going to assume he's going to have the same thing again, and then give him 27.4% of the total team targets of 543 to get him 149 targets. I repeat this process for receptions, touchdowns, and other relevant categories across both CBS and ESPN. And then once I have their averages separately, I then combine their averages to get a holistic view of how a player is going to go from two different sources. We can now see that Justin Jefferson's new totals are 1,465 receiving yards and 166 targets between the two. I can now compare my projections with Prize Pick season-long betting lines. Sportsbooks tend to slightly undervalue players, but they do so consistently. Every player that you'll see at season-long projections will have 150, 200 yards less on their projection than what these CBS and ESPNs out there are projecting their season-long projections to be. But their consistency can make this useful for validation. We can also look at their prior year stats and then see if there's any off-season changes, training camp news, or injuries that would be a reason to validate these new totals that they have. So Justin Jefferson had 1,533 receiving yards last year. He's projected 1,465, fairly reasonable. He had 154 targets last year, and he's combined projected 166. We know that Jordan Addison is going to be missing the first 3 games of the season. If JJ receives 4 more targets per game over those 3 games, that would be 12 more targets total. That would already bring him up from his 154 to 166. And that's not even mentioning the improvement for JJ McCarthy in this offense. Now that we've verified and averaged our stats, I convert everything into PPR fantasy points. Once I have the total fantasy points for his season-long projections, I can then divide these totals by 17 to get a per game production, which is key for comparing players across positions. I also, in my videos, like to compare on the yellow numbers, for example, their prior year stats with their projected next year stats. I feel like if you just tell people stats, one, they ask how I get them, which is why I'm making this video. And two, they don't really have the perspective of what happened a year ago. So having that comparison also helps put people in the mindset of, wow, this player was actually able to do this, or, well, I don't really think that they can do this. But these fantasy points per games will give me my rankings. And how I do that is once everybody has their fantasy points per game, I can then sort them as simply as just doing highest to lowest, and it'll give me my rankings. I then compare those rankings that I have with consensus ADP to find which players are then overvalued, undervalued, or appropriately priced in drafts. Here are my current top 5 wide receiver and running back rankings for the season. As new information comes out, injuries, depth chart changes, preseason performance, I refresh my data and update my rankings. I share those rankings with you as clearly and consistently as I can. If you found this breakdown helpful, drop a like and subscribe to Evan Jake Sports for more data-driven fantasy content. Let me know in the comments if you want a deep dive into a specific position or player. And as always, trust the data, not the drama.